It's the early 2010s, and for the past 4 or 5 years of your semi-functional consciousness, you've been playing whatever PC or console games money can buy. A couple were hand-me-downs, many you didn't get the point of, but some were fun. However, all of them shared one single problem. Given enough time, they all turned into a tiresome pattern of replaying the same few levels over and over. You wished, really wished, for a way around this. To make your own custom objectives and enemies to destroy. Theoretically, the amount of fun you could then get out of a single game would be infinite. Despite the solution being so obvious to you, almost all of the games you own didn't include such a feature. And by not having access to this level editor idea, it was as if you weren't allowed to flex your creativity. Of course, there were some exceptions to this, but that's a video for another time. Point is, you wanted the ability to use the game's engine to make things of your own, or just to screw around by spamming characters and explosives to destroy. Definitely a lot more of this than the former. Okay, well how does this relate to anything? So you've recently discovered this thing called YouTube. Gradually, you begin learning about games that include a level editor. Of course, at the time you didn't know it was called that, but still. Eventually, one subset begins to stand out. Flash games. To avoid a lengthy explanation, Flash was a program used by many aspiring game developers and animators. In the early days of YouTube, Flash animation saw massive success, until the ingenious algorithmic move to favor long videos over hard work, that is. Flash games, however, were typically spread across many smaller websites. This led to many sites inevitably hosting the same collections of games, and along with a number of other reasons I won't go into, resulted in arguably the biggest reason Flash games were such a big deal. You could play them for free. So today, I want to go over my favorite Flash games, or game series rather, what they mean to me, and why most people will never be able to play them again. But wait, what do I mean by that? Well, I assume most of you already know this, but in July of 2017, Adobe announced that Flash and related applications will no longer receive support come the end of 2020. Thankfully, due to this date had to be pushed back, and instead, Flash stopped all functionality by January of 2021. This means that since then, all the millions of Flash games and applications which once existed no longer work. Forgotten. For the unending march of time. I am, of course, heavily over-exaggerating things, as people have taken the opportunity to save as many as they can. You can find archives containing millions of these games online, but that still unfortunately means future generations won't be able to play these games without going out of their way to figure out how. On top of this, there's undoubtedly many other Flash games which are completely forgotten about, never given the chance to be preserved. Luckily in my case, the Flash games I primarily grew up with were saved, and even if that hadn't happened, I did so myself. Anyways, let's finally get into the games I wish to cover today, from least to most memorable, starting with Freerider 2. Of course, it'd be foolish to jump right in without discussing this game's predecessor. Freerider 1 was released in February of 2007, first appearing on the site One More Level. Now, you might have noticed something regarding its name. It's very similar to another game, one that's arguably more popular, Line Rider, released back in 2006. On the surface, both games' concepts are almost the same. A figure traverses a bunch of lines until reaching the end. There are key differences though. Line Rider's main focus is on designing courses and decorating them, plus from what I could tell, you don't even control the character. In Freerider you do, as well as the ability to turn the character around, and placing stars which can count towards level completion. The game, however, does have its limitations and issues. You can't rotate too much without failing the level and needing to restart, and you can easily fall into a death loop by removing the starting platform, with there being no way to pause the game. You can save and share levels, but the format looks confusing, and even intimidating to an extent. In fact, it looks so ridiculous YouTube thinks it's spam when you share saves and comment sections. You can also fail levels by impaling yourself, which if done so in the right way, creates this comical event where you can simultaneously beat a level and die at the same time. Ah yes, this must be Schrodinger's stunt game. Freerider 2 was released a year later in 2008, and according to the Freerider HD website, became the most popular of the series with over 500 million players worldwide. This version of the game saw many improvements and new features, notably an actual pause button, but you also no longer get spammed with death messages during endless freefall. Schrodinger's course is also still possible, but in terms of new features, you have 3 options for a background other than the white void: hills, city, and clouds, as well as the ability to add scenery of your own. It is just the usual simple lines, but these ones are great instead. There's also no power-ups you can add such as slow motion, temporarily slowing you down, gravity, which can change the direction you'll fall, speed boosts, launching you in any specified direction, and lastly bombs, which will make you explode. Now personally I'd argue those aren't power-ups, but hey. Anyways, you might be wondering what the heck I'm playing as on screen. Clearly, this ain't a cyclist. That's because Freerider 2 has different vehicles you can play as, each one having their own strengths and weaknesses, besides this one which essentially makes you immortal. Yes, I know that implies I suck at this game. There's a normal BMX guy, a truck, a unicyclist, which is basically the cyclist only worse, a helicopter and a hot air balloon which grant the ability to fly, the mountain biker, with practically no difference between it and the original BMX guy, and of course this black square, the most famous of vehicles. There is this funny thing I remember doing though, whereby spamming lines over the starting point causes it to freak out. With these additions, it's clear how Free Rider 2 wound up so much more popular compared to its predecessor. Despite it still being tough to stay alive, the odd decision to change the switch directions key from X to Z, the controls messing up when gravity changes, and the save feature still being just as confusing. Free Rider 2 remains a large improvement, but it's still not the final game. Free Rider 3 exists, I guess. I don't know when it was released, and apart from the user interface changing, not much is different. Oh, besides all the cool vehicles getting removed, leaving just the BMX and mountain biker, as well as the unique backgrounds. So basically, from Free Rider 1 to 2, more things were added, and from 2 to 3, the exact opposite occurred. Amazing. Last thing of note for this version, it was published to a site called Armor Games. Keep them in mind. So, what's the state of Free Rider today? Well, it's actually still playable online, via the Free Rider HD site I referenced. It's yet again another version, but hey, the vehicles are back. Only they're now a second set of optional power-ups. Setting that aside, there's many custom levels you can play by folks way more talented than me, so check them out if you so choose. Crush the Castle 1 was released to the Armor Games website on April 28, 2009, and unlike Free Rider 3, they made it themselves. The premise is simple. You operate a trebuchet, and launch various materials at characters within castle-like structures, your goal being to eliminate them in as few throws as possible. Now, like with Free Rider 3, this might remind you of another game franchise, Angry Birds. And since I was curious, turns out Angry Birds was released around December of 2009. So you tell me who copied who. In all seriousness, Crush the Castle was actually inspired by an earlier game called Castle Cloud. Yes, that's the name. That word does not mean what you think it does. Clearly, this is just a genre of games. But what's Crush the Castle actually like? Well, apart from the left or right arrow keys to pan around, it operates entirely by mouse. You left-click once to swing the trebuchet and again to launch the payload. However, there's a limited amount of throws you can make. In terms of unique materials, there's 4 different types of projectiles, 3 of which are rocks of increasing sizes, and the 4th a bomb. There's 4 more options, but they're the same projectiles only tripled up. I'm sure it'd be absolutely thrilling to listen back on the thought process behind this. To make the game more balanced, you unlock new projectile types as you progress through levels. Additionally, castles can use stronger materials as you progress. Wood is supposedly the weakest, followed by stone and then metal. However, there's a lot to be desired. Besides the uninspired projectile options, the castle materials all feel the same, and by that, I mean they're unbreakable, even with bombs. This can be shrugged off, but it leads to annoying situations where enemies can wind up trapped, to such an extent where you're forced to restart the level. Unless of course you're creating a custom castle to destroy. The game's story is also, well...
These dark times require swift action on your part. If our kingdom is to survive, it is in our interest to crush any resistance. I order thee to lay siege to castles in the realm and do away with their owners.
So according to the king, we must crush any resistance for his kingdom to survive. Sounds more like we're working for an expansionist megalomaniac, rather than fighting for survival. But whatever, game functionality matters the most here. Almost a year and a half later, Crush the Castle 2 is released. So, what made this game more memorable than Free Rider 2? Let's start with the weapons. Ignoring that they must be unlocked, there's a total of 16 projectiles, half of which are the same single or triple pairs like in the original, only instead of 3 rocks with slight size variations, they're now different materials entirely, the most basic of which being the log, the first thing you start with in the main game. Following this is the stone, then the most impactful of the 3 being a metal ball. Next up is the bombs, now in their own entire section. We'll get to why that is later. Most importantly, they can now destroy objects. I mean, so can the normal projectiles too now, but... Okay, which would you prefer, this or a Minecraft Oak log? Apart from the normal bomb, there's now one that uses a fuse instead of being instant, a parachute bomb, which does what you expect, and lastly a bomb you can detonate remotely, allowing you to throw as many as you want before causing the actual explosion. Lastly, there's a section that I'll call alchemy. Could be wrong, but I'm too lazy to play that far into the campaign right now. This is where things get fun. There's the
fire flask,
which can destroy enemies and anything made out of wood, a jar of eels, useful for castles with a lot of metal, this ice thing, that'll freeze anything it touches, resulting in said things becoming much easier to destroy, a bottle of acid, which skips the previous step and can erode anything given enough time it throws. And finally, there's a black hole. Do I really need to describe what it does? Obviously, this makes things extremely easy, so you don't unlock it till near the end or after beating the game. Onto the castle builder. While the first game was limited to just 5 backgrounds, you can now mix and match foregrounds, backgrounds, time, and even weather. Heck, you can modify the terrain itself. I don't know Flash's limitations, but this still surprises me. Castles themselves have many new floor and wall options, as well as more characters and props, including explosive barrels. Because of course, the main story is also more intricate, with the different weapon sections corresponding to new characters as they join you on your journey of crushing your enemies. Morality concerns difference aside, the king sends you on another journey, this time to the islands of Crushtania. But with a name like that, I guess it's more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right off the bat, you're joined by a mason to provide you your initial materials. Throughout your quest to decimate all of civilization on Betsonian Island, you gradually unlock Helgrim's projectiles. Upon moving to the next island labeled South Promontory, if I pronounce that wrong, take it up with my lawyer, you unlock the next projectile section, gaining the help of Corman the Engineer, the local bomb expert. Again, morals aside, after completing this section followed by the North Island, the final character joins you, Moral the Great, a wizard who provides all the unique alchemy projectiles I described 3 paragraphs ago. And well, that's basically it for Crush the Castle 2, arguably the most popular version of the franchise. I highly recommend trying it out for yourself. But what actually happened to the series? Did it simply end after this version? Well, sometime later Armor Games would release Crush the Castle 3, which is seemingly unplayable today due to archives having not been made of it, at least from where I've looked. Thanks to this fan site, not much appears to be that different aside from the addition of silver and bronze medals. Wait, what's that to the right? Oh, it's 2 more games I've never heard about until now. Yeah, I'm just gonna say those weren't archived either. Definitely not in desperate search for a way to avoid talking about them or anything. There are also these things called player packs, with the first one being released a few months after Crush the Castle 1. From what I can tell, they're custom versions in which Armor Games took castle submissions from the community and built their own stories around them. Pretty neat. Crush the Castle 2's version is especially interesting, as it also includes a brand new game mode. It's much like a tower defense game, which makes sense because it's not a one-off venture in that genre for the series, but instead of whatever this entails, you fend off hordes of zombies for as long as you can, unlocking new projectiles by earning money. I believe this was also in Crush the Castle 3, but I've got no way of verifying that. With all that said, how is Armor Games doing today? Even back then, many of their Flash games promoted a mobile equivalent, and while I don't know what happened to these games in particular, they seem to be working on new versions to this day. There's this one, seemingly called Crush the Castle, with it not having a number after it. This surely means that it's the official and final iteration of the game, so should you play it? Well, the reviews suggest otherwise, with it seemingly being designed to get you to watch ads and like the other greedy practices. Well, that's fine. There's this other one called Crush the Castle Legacy. This one's said to include all the Flash classics in it, so surely this— nope. The reviews here are even worse. On top of advertisements, there was little to no attempt at optimizing these games to be playable on mobile devices. So, what about this Crush the Castle Siege Master? Surprisingly, its reviews are fairly decent. Does that mean you should play it? Probably not. Aside from the graphics being way too cartoony and different from the originals in my opinion, I also tend to follow the rule that if a game says it contains ads and or in-app purchases, don't play it. So, if you don't care to participate in this depressing era of modern game design, go right ahead. In my eyes though, Armor Games fell off. More like fell off the castle wall, am I wrong? There are certain things that, while meaning absolutely nothing for your day-to-day life as a kid, they just stick with you. For me, one of these things is a particular song. You're on your iPod Touch, sitting in a massive pillow fort formed from tearing apart the living room couches, simply because you felt like it. You're scrolling through videos you largely don't remember now, but thanks to one song, 4 of them have stuck in your mind ever since. It's a playthrough of some Flash game you hadn't heard of, produced by a guy whose username you still can't pronounce right years later. I'm talking about Huje Tower 2 is what truly made Flash games resonate with me. On its own, it's just another game. In fact, to some, its whole existence is controversial, but we'll get to that later. We first gotta start with the original, Huje Tower 1. It's hard to say when it was released, but the earliest gameplay I could find is from July of 2009. The concept is simple. You're provided a bunch of these creatures, and while they're called bacteria here, elsewhere they're called Hujos, so for the sake of this video I'll call them that. Sounds like a breakfast cereal. Anyways, you drag into a pre-existing structure to build upon it, the goal being to reach the height specified by each level. Of course, it's not that simple. There are many problems you must get around. For one, you have a limited number of Hujos, and depending on the type provided, they can't be used more than once, meaning upon placing one in your tower, they're stuck there permanently. Certain levels will provide more to build with at higher altitudes, but they're asleep. To wake them up, you first gotta reach them with your tower. The level select screen, apart from portraying how high you've gotten, pay attention, also displays which levels use new Hujo variants. These include the green ones, which are reusable unlike the red ones you start with, the yellow Hujos, which hook onto certain surfaces, providing a strong point to build off of, brown Hujos, which are much heavier, making them useful for certain physics puzzles, white Hujos that act as balloons, useful for building above large gaps, and also say this.
You wanna get high?
Wheels, let me stress that again. Wheels. The black Hujos can be used to build much stronger structures. I don't know how else to describe them. Play for yourself and you'll see what I mean. Lastly, there's the blue ones, which you only see in like 2 levels. Despite this, in my opinion they're the most useful, doubling the building range and drastically reducing the number of guys needed to build with. The game's story is simple. These bacteria guys were living in the sewers, as you do, when one day, they get a glance at the skies above. Following this discovery, they decide that that's where they want to be, and it's on you to help them build towards such a goal. Literally. Now, there's something else I alluded to at the start of this section. Huje Tower, in its entirety, is apparently controversial. How? Well, as I was seeking references for this video, I discovered many comments claiming Huje Tower is a blatant ripoff of another game, World of Goo. This was mainly emphasized through shared base game concepts, level design, and even stories. Granted, that's only if a bunch of angry nerds cared to actually explain their reasons, but still. So let's go through these points, if not with a touch of frustration from someone who grew up with one game series and not the other. World of Goo was first released on October 13th, 2008. And by looking at multiple screenshots, yes, there was clearly some inspiration here, from the sleeping creatures to the different types provided. Furthermore, comparing this release date to my rough estimate on Huje Tower should be enough to prove who did it first. So, did Huje Tower get the majority of its ideas from World of Goo? Yes. Does that make it a copy and or outright plagiarism? No. For one, World of Goo provides much more content, enough to warrant it being a full game that you can purchase on Steam. Secondly, Huje Tower's main focus is the concept/genre alone. By that, I mean it has no story. World of Goo has a story. A strange one, but again enough to make it a product you'd pay for. 2D Boy, the developer behind World of Goo, doesn't own this game genre, regardless of influence. It's very common for aspiring developers to take concepts from popular games and make their own, especially with Flash games. But if anything, the existence of Huje Tower only strengthened the popularity of World of Goo, a symbiotic relationship where by having a free option, fans who'd want more of said genre could go on to play the full game on Steam. Anyways, enough trying to legitimately justify enjoying Huje Tower, time to resort to hate-filled attacks against the other side. Actually, you know what? No. I've grown past that as a person, and seeing as these comments are over a decade old, I'd like to assume they have too. So here's this GIF instead. Out of all of the Flash games I've played, Huje Tower 2 is my favorite by far. Like the original, I got no clue when it was released, apart from being in 2010. I also must admit that this game's weird. Instead of building for the skies above, there's this guy, and you gotta feed him a given number of Huges required to pass each level. That's it. No story this time, or even intro cutscene. The way to achieve this is by having the red Huges follow your cursor to him. They're also the only type he'll eat, so it's best to build structures out of any other types provided before resorting to him. Speaking of types, Huje Tower 2 doesn't include all the same guys from the original, opting to remove the wheels and blue ones. One of the main reasons I chose to discuss the games I have today is due to them featuring a level editor, and without a doubt, Huje Tower 2's is the best. Revisiting the game in a non-website format seems to have messed with objects' hitboxes and scaling, but the core elements are the same. You start with an empty void, having nothing but a changeable static background image. There's 3 tabs at the top of the screen, labeled items 1, 2, and 3. Great job, you learned to count. The section you start in contains your static objects. Things not affected by gravity such as surfaces, hazardous spikes, and other things like slime for yellow Huges and breakable glass. The next one holds all the Huges itself, along with the old guy and several physics objects. Apart from this one that has spikes, they all act the same. And no, you can't put Huges in the tire and have them roll around in it. It was quite tempting to put this below Crush the Castle upon learning this. The item 3 section holds special objects and tools. These are things that will either affect whatever they're placed over, or other objects in the environment. Starting from the left, the plus sign allows you to pin objects in place. If you also don't want them rotating after the fact, there's an option to prevent just that. Next there's this, which instead causes rotation for wherever you place it over an object. Then there's this line, used to link two things together. This can range from stationary objects, physics objects, and even characters. It can also be used alongside the next item, which causes anything it's placed over to slide back and forth, in whatever direction you choose. Next up are some miscellaneous physics objects I don't care to go over, followed by a bunch of things with the sole purpose to rotate in place. Lastly, there's a fan that will affect Huges and items in the environment, a wheel that turns, and an anvil, which has the sole purpose of breaking glass, and is otherwise harmless. With few exceptions, all these items, physical or not, can be scaled or rotated in whatever way you wish. Moreover, say you're making a complex level and need more space to build, you can increase the size of the level itself. Granted, this makes it slightly annoying to navigate, but still. The number of unique levels this amount of customization inspired was crazy. Sadly, due to what happened with Flash, they're all unplayable now. The user level section just loads indefinitely, and the servers that once hosted them all have likely long since shut down. The same is true for Crush the Castle, and even if the player packs preserve some, they're only a fraction of what once existed. So, what became of Huje Tower as a series? Was it remade for modern platforms like the other two? Well, no. Plus, some might argue that's what World of Goo is for. If you consider this to be an anticlimactic ending, it's ultimately the result of applications being given an expiration date its users have no power over. And while this depressing conclusion is unavoidable for such a video, I still felt as if I were missing something. There was another game in the series, a Huje Tower 3. The only reason I was so sure was because it stood out so much from the games before it. It was heavily story-driven, featuring a player character that you direct to an end goal just like with Huje Tower 2. Despite this, I could find nothing about it online. I even asked Tasselfoot, the man behind the walkthroughs on both games. Sadly, he too couldn't recall it, my terrible description aside. And I would have just left it at this, if it weren't for one last attempt. Somewhere I probably should have looked sooner. Huge Adventure. It was real. Not only this, but there's also a fourth game, Huge Way. Additionally, the developer, Maxime, or Mokus as he goes by online, just so happens to be the guy who uploaded the first Huge Tower video. Like before, it's not stated when Huge Tower was released, but it had surprisingly been in development since 2009. Before we get to it though, it's best I briefly go over Huge Way. And shocker, I actually mean briefly this time. Huge Way is essentially a very basic version of Huge Tower 2. In fact, I'm convinced it's just an earlier version. The goal is the exact same as before, only in this game there's no building. Other Huges don't even make an appearance. Instead, physics are the main focus, as you have to move around green objects to guide the Hugos on their path. Overall, the missing elements make the game pretty underwhelming. Much like all other games in the series, Huge Adventure's gameplay stands out in its own unique way. However, it's better to go over the story first. Following the events of Huge Tower 1, the Hugos have successfully reached an asteroid called that. As they explore, or whatever they're doing, one of the Hugos, Klaus, spots a cave. Upon getting curious, he heads in, ignoring the warnings of his friends. Suddenly, he gets jumped by a wave of green slime, I guess. Later, he wakes up not remembering anything, having been transformed into some new, strange slime creature. Following this cutscene, the game starts, and unlike all those before it, you control Klaus directly, guiding him through levels. Amidst his occasional self-aware and programming jokes, he slowly recollects fragments of memories, parts of his past as a Red Hugo. Does he remember everything by the end of the game? I don't know, I didn't play through it all. Oh right, the gameplay. It's a combination of a platform and the usual building from Huge Tower. Using Hugos to construct bridges, or towers, you then control Klaus to climb through them. It makes for very unique gameplay, even if the controls feel a bit slow at times. You can also press space to literally slow down time, though it's only one use per attempt. Besides the typical hazards platformers have and some strange enemies, there's not much else for me to say. The game has a list of achievements, most of which are these circles in hard to reach areas. By getting them all, you unlock ski goggles for Klaus to wear. Why exactly? I don't know. But hey, seems like Mokus is a fan of skiing. At the end of the day though, these games are great examples of how not everything has to be extremely elaborate and contain complex stories. Games can be made for the sole purpose of being fun. And for a time in the early stages of the internet, that's what Flash games were for me. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. This was a lot different from my recent videos, so hopefully that's not a bad thing. Feel free to subscribe, and hopefully my next video won't be as much of a nightmare to write the script for. With that said, see ya.